This is a part of our MGH SpearMed Space Medicine Fellowship. This is a series of lectures that I give on risk and human spaceflight. And it's one of the areas that is poorly understood by many folks. It's also one of the areas that drives, or at least has historically driven, an awful lot of conversation and discussion. And often when you get to the point where you're asking, why can't I get this thing to work, or why can't we get that thing on the spacecraft? It usually comes down to a question of risk. And I tend to think of risk as the inverse of safety. But we're going to go through a series of 5 lectures here that talk about some of the broad strokes about risk and how to understand it, how to think about it, and talk about it, and how did NASA do it? How should we look at doing it going into the future? How does it relate to the evidence base that we have in science? And how do we do some very specific things with it? And that series is really designed to get folks just thinking about risk as more than a hand-waving argument for things. Because so much of what happens in human spaceflight when you get down to the brass tacks of things is trying to figure out what can we put on the spacecraft, right? And everything that you want to put in there is competing with everything else. And so you have to have some way to prioritize what is the most important stuff. And prioritizing is difficult because oftentimes it is trying to compare apples and oranges. And so when we start using standardized methods for quantifying risk, then we actually have ways to start comparing those things and how necessary or useful they are, and prioritizing those things in a way that allows them to be compared to each other. So that's where we're headed. This is a set of 5 lectures. I kind of broke it apart into different parts. And we're going to start at the beginning, which is people complaining. So when I was at NASA and I was chairing the Human System Risk Board, a lot of times whenever anybody would make an argument that we needed to collect some data, we needed to measure something, we needed to add in a requirement on something that goes on the vehicle, we got a lot of excuses. And oftentimes it was folks who were not speaking from a place of being informed by something, but just having a sense of it, right? And these were some of the sort of excuses that we got, right? We can't measure that, or we don't know how. We can't calculate this risk. We don't have enough data, which is a common thing in spaceflight. Some people compare and incorrectly think that risk is the same thing as uncertainty, which is not. When we get to evidence, people will say, well, this one paper clearly says that this is what we should do, and therefore that's the end of the discussion. And when we get into the point where we're talking about the evidence base and papers, we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that come along with that. For anyone who's done medicine, who's been through a medical school or residency or any of those things, you've been through journal clubs, and you know that we all struggle with looking at papers and trying to critically evaluate them. We all take time professionally to do that. And we all ask ourselves the question, hey, should this change my management? And with risk, you're kind of doing the same thing, but we're doing it oftentimes more quantitatively than we do in medicine. And a lot of it comes from the engineering world. So we're going to talk through that. When we talk about risk, right, we have a place that we struggle with, and that is oftentimes with definitions. So this is a great quote from one of the Apollo flight directors. He said, when we first started flying in space, people would say things like, well, the spacecraft's got to be good. But then what the hell does good mean? And it's a very fair question, right? And it happens all the time in space medicine and spaceflight engineering, right? There's this question of what is good enough. And risk, the field of risk management, is actually part of the answer to that. So I want to take you back a little bit and just give you a little bit of history, right? Risk and risk management is something that we have been doing as a species for a very long time. We have known how to do some of these things in certain ways as far back as ancient Babylon, when we had buyers and traders giving interest on loans that were conditioned on the arrival of goods, because there was some risk that the goods that somebody paid for would not necessarily arrive due to the challenges of traveling the Silk Road or sailing across the Atlantic or things like that, right? And so lots of different societies have dealt with this. We've seen it in Babylon. We saw it in the Code of Hammurabi, where there were indemnifications for bandits and floods. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't as numerical. And when the Age of Enlightenment got here and we really started becoming a lot more quantitative in the way that we approached our sciences, probability theory and statistics were invented, and that changed the whole nature of how we handle risk. And those procedures, those processes, were then applied to a lot of different things. So from the 18th to the 20th century, we see them in insurance, banking, financial markets, public health, all sorts of different places. In the 40s, we developed nuclear power, and people who are spending lots of money on things like oil exploration, they want better ways to try to understand the risk that they are taking. And is it a good risk? Is it a bad risk? How much am I likely to lose? All of that. And as we created better and better methods for handling this, eventually computers showed up and things got to be very mature in the way we think about risk. Now, I show this book on the right side, Against the Gods. It is a fascinating book. It tells the history of the story of risk and how we do it, how we think about it, and how we came to think about it through lots of famous scientists and other people who came up with stuff. So if you're interested in risk management, which I can't imagine why you would be, but if you're interested, this is a great book that helps you get a sense of that background. So we're going to start with definitions. So the definition of risk. Now, there's a bunch of different places you could look for this, and a lot of times the wording is going to be slightly different from across slightly different textbooks or other things like that. But here's the ones that we're going to use, right? The definition of risk is the probability and magnitude. And that's a really important part, the magnitude of a loss, disaster, or other undesirable event. And if we just simplify that, right, we intuitively know that we're talking about, hey, something bad can happen, and we're trying to figure out how we get our heads wrapped around it. Management, on the other hand, planning, organization, coordination, control, and direction of resources towards a defined objective, right? We're using what we have to try to get what we need. And management is its own skill set. And when you put these things together, right, then we try to mash them together and get a good definition of what risk management is. So the identification, the assessment, and the prioritization, I bolded that one because this is the step that we often leave out. Prioritization of risks, followed by coordinated and economical application of resources to minimize, monitor, and control the probability and or the impact of unfortunate events, right? You've heard this now a couple times. Probability and magnitude, probability and impact. There are two parts to risk. Both of them are critical. And oftentimes you'll hear people only talk about one part, probability, without talking about what magnitude are we talking about? What impact are we talking about? And when we use it, we're really just talking about, all those words just mean trying to be smart about how we take chances in business, in life, in designing spacecraft, any of those things. So that history that we talked about, it's important to kind of know that there are 4 types of risk management. And the reason why it's important to know that is because some of them are reliable and good, and some of them are less reliable and not so great. So the first one, actuaries, this is a scientific method that's used for insurance and pensions. It's a very common thing you hear about actuarial science. The reason why we do not use this in spaceflight is because we don't have enough data. There's a big difference between doing statistical analysis of lots of information and having only a little bit of information and still trying to do the best that you can with that information. So in the best case scenario, and this is why insurance companies use them, actuaries are one of the best ways to do this. In World War II, and around that time frame, there's a group that was called the war quants pulled together and started creating probabilistic risk assessment, decision analysis, operations research. These are fields that are alive and well today, mathematical fields that really form the basis for some of the strongest way to do this when you do not have enough data to do actuarial methods. Okay. Where you will most often hear about risk management is in economics. There were a bunch of folks that tried to apply variations on some of these methods to financial analysis tools, to use them for financial instruments and portfolios. They met with varying levels of success and failure. Oftentimes, what was really lost was the rigor that was required to get the same type of reliable information that the actuaries and the war quants could get. And then you have an entire group of people who are management consultants who basically just kind of advertise themselves as risk management and do intuitive approaches and individual experience. And these ones are the ones that kind of give everybody a bad name in risk management, because there are very rigorous and robust ways to go about assessing risk. And then there are people who have used the terminology to forward their own careers without actually ever having applied the rigor. So I give you this because I want you to know that the term risk management, you'll see it thrown around a lot out there. And you need to understand which of these domains we're talking about when you hear it. When we're talking about human spaceflight, we're really doing what the war quants did, using PRA and tools like that, that were helping these industries to mature. So I mentioned this in one of the first slides, which is uncertainty and risk are two different things. And I'm giving you the definitions here, right? We've already talked about the definition of risk on the right. It's a state of uncertainty where some of the possibilities involve a loss, injury, catastrophe, or other undesirable outcome. That is something that is quantifiable. Okay. Uncertainty, or the lack of complete certainty, is the existence of more than one possibility. We don't know what the outcome, state, result, or value is. And sometimes it's really difficult to kind of tease these apart. Uncertainty is unmeasurable. Risk is measurable. Okay. And so the examples that I give you here, right? The measurement of uncertainty, we say there's a set of probabilities that are assigned to possibilities. So there's a 60% chance it's going to rain tomorrow, 40% chance it won't. We don't know if it's going to rain, right? We wait and see. When we're talking about risk, you can see that the example is a little bit different. It's a set of possibilities with quantified probabilities and quantified losses. So compare and contrast this statement, right? We believe there's a 40% chance that the proposed oil well will be dry. That's a probability. And that means that we would lose $12 million in exploratory drilling costs. That is the quantified loss. That is the impact. That is the magnitude that we talked about before. There's no impact or magnitude on the uncertainty side, right? Rain or don't rain, we don't really get a sense of, is that good or bad? If you're singing in the rain, maybe it's a good thing. I don't know, right? So this is something that just realize that uncertainty and risk are related, but they are not the same things, and don't allow folks to try to mash them together. Okay, so how do we talk about risk information? How do we present it? I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples, and we're going to start with the Challenger, or with the Space Shuttle example. So what you're seeing here is actually a retrospective analysis of the Space Shuttle over time that was done at NASA. And what you see over here is that the very first Space Shuttle, STS-1, they had estimated about a 1 in 12 chance of loss. Now, this is a probabilistic risk assessment from retrospective data, meaning they didn't have this when they started, right? We didn't know was exactly around this area, ballpark. This is looking back, right? Having about 135 flights and saying, okay, how did it change over time with what we did know about the program? And so what I want you to get a sense of is that early in this process, right, we have fairly high uncertainty and fairly high risk. Okay. This is the probability of loss of crew. So now you have probability as a number, but you have specified your impact. Everybody dies, right? That is a pretty concerning impact. And so the probability that everybody was going to die on any given set of flights, you can see over time goes down. And we're going to see that in a few other places. Over here, it goes up. It bounces up when Challenger happens. And we learn more about the failure modes of the system. We learned more about the failure modes of the system when Columbia happened as well. When you get to the end of the lifetime here of the space shuttle, you are looking at a 1 in 90 risk number, right? So what does that number mean? That means that the chances, the probability that the crew is going to be lost, is going to be all killed riding on the space shuttle, to the best of our understanding of that vehicle, everybody who got on there had a 1 in 90 chance of dying every time they did that. So where does that put us in the real world? The bombing over daylight in Germany, in B-17 pilots, in World War II, they had about a 1 in 78 chance of dying. So we're in the same ballpark, just getting up on the space shuttle, as we were when people were flying those B-17s over Germany and getting shot at and shot down all the time, right? That's the risk that astronauts have been taking when they were doing it in the space shuttle. We do have enough information to have information on the Soyuz, which is a little bit better than the shuttle in terms of reliability and likelihood of loss of crew, but those have not been perfect either. We don't have tons of information on Dragon yet, and some of the newer vehicles coming up. So we're still trying to create these things. Now, keep in mind, right, this magnitude, this amount of risk you're going to take, 1 in 90, and we're going to talk about some other things. So even when we're not talking about loss of life, this is just cumulative failure rate for a variety of different launch vehicles, right? The shuttle is in there. It's the X's here, which are down here. And it's doing pretty well compared to a lot of these other things, which have flown more to some extent, right? The Atlas vehicle, the Redstone, the Delta, the Soyuz, okay? Cumulative failure rates, which is something that's different than loss of crew, okay? And then down here you see the Saturn, and early on in the Titan program is what's going on there. So you see over time that all of these are following a similar trend. The more we use them, the more we learn about how they operate, and we iterate and make them better and safer typically. And this is a common pattern in risk. Okay. But this is comparing, what the shuttle was like to what these uncrewed vehicles are like in many cases. Now, cars and airplanes. It's not enough to just show you this for spacecraft, right? I want you to get a sense of risk generally, because that same principle holds across everything else that we're looking at. So fatal accidents per billion miles driven, you can see for automobiles dropping over time, down from 10 to the minus 8th, 10 to the minus 9th, right, through the 2000s. For general aviation and commercial aviation, fatal accidents per thousands of hours. You see that same pattern where they drop over time. Okay. Risk reduction is happening through usage. And we haven't used tons and tons of spacecraft yet, regardless of in comparison to things like aviation or automobiles. Those are vehicles, right? What about people? Because even in a vehicle, you might have more than one person. So on the space shuttle, maybe you had up to 7 people. look at risk from the perspective of climbing things like Denali and Rainier and Mount Everest. Now you can look at mountaineering fatality rates per participant, per individual. And that's a little bit of a different story from how did the vehicle do, right? Because there is no vehicle in mountaineering. Now it's the person and the activity. And we've taken that vehicle out of there. And you can see it's there's a certain level of risk involved. Over the years, maybe you can sort of convince yourself there's a downward trend here. It's kind of harder to tell a little bit, but you got pretty reasonable chances of dying if you try to do these things. These are fatalities from mountaineering. But what I want you to take away from that is that usage and risk have a relationship, right? The more we do something, the more we use something, the more over time we figure out how to make it safer, which means over time we see the risk go down with usage. And that's an important thing, because right now what's happening in the commercial spaceflight industry is there are new vehicles that are coming online that are going to have no history of usage, right? And those are some of the riskiest times to be trying things. Over time, as with everything, we'll see some of that improvement. So why am I talking about all this stuff? The reason why is because how you talk about and frame some of these variables in risk really can set you up for success or failure in terms of communicating a message and understanding what's happening with a spacecraft, with astronauts on EVAs, with other things like this. So when we're talking about vehicles versus people, right, these are two different frames of reference for risk, right? We can give you definitions for all these things, right? Fatality is pretty straightforward. A fatal accident. A vehicle trip is a single trip, but that's different from vehicle hours, right? If you said how often are you likely to die on a trip from Chicago to Washington versus how often how many vehicle hours for each death, you're conveying different information. And when you talk about the vehicle, it's one thing. And as I mentioned, when you talk about people, it's a whole other thing. But the way that these are conveyed in terms of the rates that you use, right? Is it person trips? Is it person miles? Is it person hours for things like fatalities? All of these are going to convey different information. And if you're not careful, you can end up kind of miscommunicating risk. And so this is part of the challenge, right? This is talking about unprocessed data, right? Just information that somebody gives you on risk. If you have not processed the fatality data or processed the impact data and figured out how to tell that story, you're going to end up kind of messing up relationships between things that you really shouldn't make. So look at this example, right? 10 fatalities over the course of an hour, that can be perceived as high risk. But 10 fatalities over the course of a century is likely low risk. Very obvious case of the rate and the denominator matters, and it matters a lot, okay? So if we want to compare spaceflight to other things, just saying total fatalities or total fatal accidents really doesn't give you the picture, right? You could say that the Space Shuttle had 2 fatal accidents while automobiles had 30,000 fatal accidents in a year. And you would be arbitrarily kind of sending a message that automobiles are much more dangerous than the spacecraft, right? But you're leaving out tons of information. So part of risk is sort of putting that correct information into place, right? How do we do that? Take a look at automobiles, right? Not just fatalities or fatal accidents, but how many fatalities or how many person trips did we have? 10 to the 11th. How many person trips on the Space Shuttle? 10 to the 2, right? A tiny, tiny amount of trips as compared to automobiles. So the denominator really matters when you're trying to compare these things, all right? And if we go to graphically represent it, this is where you start to see this matter, right? If you say, how many fatal accidents per 1,000 vehicle trips did we have? with the Space Shuttle and the Soyuz, right? Because there were 135 shuttle trips, some more of that for Soyuz. You can see that the aviation and auto industries and things like that, they'll live down here on the low end of this curve. But if you put it in terms of vehicle hours, things start spreading out differently, right? Your aviation, your general aviation starts to get much higher, higher even than the Soyuz. And you got to ask yourself, is that an appropriate representation? Per 100 million vehicle miles, right? The shuttle has not probably gone 100 million vehicle miles. Neither is the Soyuz, but general aviation has. So if you frame it in this way, you start to make it look like Amtrak, cars, and general aviation are actually more risky than the shuttle or Soyuz. And that naturally should not feel right to you, right? So how you frame this is a critical aspect of this. These are called vehicle-centric risk metrics, right? The trips, the hours, and the miles. If you really want to do it from a human perspective, you do it from person-centric risk metrics. So the person now, fatalities is one person per those same things, 1,000 person trips, 10,000 person hours, or 100 million person miles. Again, if you do it for 1,000 person trips, right, you can see that the shuttle and the Soyuz and climbing Mount Everest are way up here, right? That you've got a lot of risk. If you start doing it for 100 million person miles, which is an appropriate number for like automobiles, you start to artificially show that cars are more dangerous than shuttles, space shuttle. And that is not true, right? Cars are much, much safer than the space shuttle. So how you choose your person-centric or vehicle-centric risk metrics matters massively. And if a number doesn't look like it makes sense, especially compared to something else, you need to start thinking about maybe we should be framing it a different way. Why? So that risk versus usage curve that I told you about, when we talk about vehicle-centric risk metrics, so fatal accidents per vehicle trip, how many times are you traveling in your car? Per trip, what's your likelihood of some sort of fatal accident? It's really low. And that's partially because the usage is really high. So when you frame this as risk versus usage, you start to see these in a way that feels better because it makes more sense. It is an appropriate representation of what the risk is. Your space shuttle and your Soyuz now, much, much higher in terms of fatal glass accidents per vehicle trip because the usage on these is so low, right? The usage on cars and aviation, like airplanes and stuff like that, though the usage on those is extremely high. But per trip, right, your chance of a fatal accident is extremely, extremely low, 10 to the minus 7 here. Whereas shuttle up here and Soyuz are at, 10 to the minus 1, 10 to the minus 2. So this is the appropriate way to be framing risk. If you do it in terms of people, right, it's not just did you lose the shuttle, but did we lose an astronaut? Again, fatalities per participant, usage, how many participants per year? This is an appropriate representation of what the risk looks like. Lots and lots of people on commercial aviation, lots and lots of people driving cars, orders of magnitude. And yet the fatality per participant is extremely low for these, right? There's a reason why this feels right, because this representation gives you the correct comparison between things like Space Shuttle Soyuz, Everest Denali, scuba diving, skydiving, cars, and commercial aviation. Right? This is something that is a concept that is super important to understand. Your representation really matters, and you have to get it right. All right, so when we move to spaceflight by itself, right, what are we using as the undesirable event, the loss or the disaster? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to define outcomes that we're trying to avoid. That's what we're doing with risk management. So typically what NASA has done is it's looked at three main outcomes, and you'll hear people talk about LOC-LOM, sometimes LOV. So this is the probability of the loss of crew, probability of loss of mission, the probability of the loss of vehicle. These are all outcomes that are not necessarily person-centric, right? These are a little bit more vehicle-centric, right? When the Challenger and the Columbia went down, it was loss of crew. There weren't going to be people who survived that, some who survived and some who didn't. So these are really mission-level outcomes that are, hey, here's the definition of the impact, right? Did everybody die? Did we lose the mission? Did we lose the vehicle? And you can have these things happen without the others. So for example, in Apollo 13, we lost the mission, which was when they were supposed to go walk on the moon and collect rocks and do all those things, right? We didn't get to do that. But we didn't lose the crew. So these things do not necessarily always happen together, all right? But anytime you're looking at one of these outcomes, you have to, in risk management, define a threshold, right? What's safe enough, right? How much, at what threshold or what level are we trying to avoid them? Because we're never going to get to perfect avoidance. We're never going to get to perfectly safe. Loss of crew has happened in many different places. And this is why we talk about space is hard, space is risky, right? It is a reality of the industry. How likely is it to happen? And what can we do to change that are part of the risk management inputs into engineering for the systems, right? So to talk through this a little bit, I want to give you some background on the Challenger. The Rogers Commission report was the report that came out after the Challenger accident. And it very nearly, it's kind of a fascinating story. It very nearly didn't give us something very useful, but because Richard Feynman was on there, and he, as a Nobel Prize winner at that point, could ask some very tough questions, he was able to drive that discussion into a place that was really helpful. And this quote is really interesting to me, right? This is after the fact, looking at how was NASA using risk numbers to make decisions on this. And Richard Feynman put into that report, he said, it appears there's enormous differences of opinion as to the probability of a failure with loss of vehicle and of human life. The estimates ranged from roughly 1 in 100 to 1 in 100,000. The higher figures, that 1 in 100, came from the working engineers, the people who understood the systems. The low figures, 1 in 100,000, came from management. And he wants to know, right, what are the causes and consequences of this lack of agreement? Since 1 part in 100,000 would imply that one could put a space shuttle up each day for 300 years expecting to lose only one, we could properly ask, what is the cause of management's fantastic faith in the machinery, right? When Challenger was going up and when NASA was pushing with all of its might to meet demanding schedules and things like that, you had managers who didn't believe the engineers' numbers on risk. And they would say, when asked the question, well, where did you get that number? Engineering judgment. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? What the hell does engineering judgment mean? Well, this is part of an article that's absolutely fascinating and worth reading. I'm not going to try to make you read it on the board here, but I'm going to highlight a little bit of a blurb that's in this article, right? The NRC report noted hazard analysis for some important high-risk systems were not updated for years at a time, even though design changes had occurred or dangerous failures were experienced. So things were happening as we learned the show. Remember I said usage increases safety, right? But a lot of the ways that we made changes to adjust things were not updated within the risk management processes. And so when you don't actually update according to the changes that were made, you have an inadequate or a non-usable risk number. It doesn't really apply to your system. And because of that, eventually we will implement things like continuous risk management, right? Where you get information and you have to keep feeding it back into the system and keep looking at things over and over again. So how do we figure this out? How do we do this the right way? there's always going to be this question of what's safe enough in not just spaceflight, but anything. And there's always going to be some disagreement about these things. Whenever you are looking at something like a spacecraft or something in human spaceflight, there's no such thing as perfectly safe, right? We all can agree on that. It's not hard to say, oh yeah, there's some risk, right? It's not, we can't be perfectly safe. But then the question mark becomes, well, how safe is safe enough? Because if you're down here at 100% unsafe, if you know it's going to fail every time, well, that's clearly not safe enough. But where's the right number in between? And this is part of the challenge and part of the art of risk management. You have to, at some point, define a threshold. The threshold says, hey, we are going to define this point as safe enough. Everything above that is safe enough. Everything below that is not safe enough. And we're going to use that a priori as our metric to say, here's what we think meets that. Here's what we have decided in terms of risk we're going to accept. And so whenever you're doing any risk management, you have to set this risk threshold and you have to figure out how to do that. So what does that mean, figure out how to do that? Well, when you set a risk threshold, right, you're making a balancing act between what is acceptable risk, right? What are the odds that everybody's going to die, for example, on a Challenger? And we know that the odds can't be zero, can't be perfect, but what's good enough? That's going to be at war with what is achievable from an engineering perspective, right? We'd love to be able to have it be balanced. In some cases, we'll have a high acceptability. And as we do that, if we say, the risk has to be really low, then we're really going to have a hard time achieving that. If we give and say, well, the risk can be pretty high, it's always easier to make less safe things, right? So there's this trade-off between what is acceptable for us and what is achievable in the engineering sense of creating a vehicle. And there is no right answer for this. This is something that happens on a program by program basis. But somebody needs to make a decision, right? You cannot make a risk threshold without having enough understanding of what is achievable, right? But at the same time, you get this struggle where figuring out what is achievable is really kind of depends on, well, what's our risk threshold? Well, how do we, what are we really aiming for? And so you get this chicken and egg problem. And so learning how to go through this process is critically important, right? Because otherwise you end up in a place where you feel like you can't do anything. So this is how we developed this. This is the process that we developed, right? We start with expert opinion. Remember that management using engineering judgment, that's a starting place for something. That is not an ending place, okay? So you start with expert opinion and you say, well, we think that a reasonable risk threshold should be here, right? If you've never done the activity before, it's really hard to do that. Human spaceflight we've been doing for 70 years. So it is completely reasonable to look at what's been done with other vehicles and other things like that and say, hey, this is where things have fallen. We'd really kind of like it to be, a little bit safer than these other ones. So we'll set the number here. So you get your risk threshold, and then you design towards that risk threshold. And the engineers start trying to put together, okay, what's it going to take systems-wise to get there? And they'll put together something, and then they'll do an analysis of that, sometimes through testing, sometimes through modeling, whatever it is. And that analysis will tell you, is this reasonable or not? So there have been places where we have done this at NASA, for example, in the Commercial Crew Program. Originally, they wanted a risk threshold for loss of crew to be 1 in 200. Or no, it was going to be 1 in 1,000 originally. And going through this process, they started to eventually figure out, that we're never going to get to that. So eventually they made it as low as 1 in 200. Okay, there's a process that was gone through. That feedback between what's acceptable and what's achievable right? You have to start someplace. So as we get more detailed knowledge and operational experience with the system, then you can kind of tighten up those numbers. But if you're at the very beginning, you're oftentimes just throwing out what we call a WAG, a wild ass guess. Okay. So yeah, here's that story, right? Constellation program was originally supposed to be 1 in 1,000 Loch Long for its missions to the ISS, but they couldn't do it. And so NASA loosened that risk threshold up to 1 in 270. And then again, they had to increase from 1 in 270 to 1 in 200 when the analysis that we were looking at indicated micrometeoroid and orbital debris was going to just keep the spacecraft from ever meeting that original risk requirement for the commercial crew program. So you can see how these analyses can kind of feed back in and start changing these numbers. These are real cases. So incrementally, if you relax these thresholds over the course of a program, you can lead to design that is technically achievable, but you also can inadvertently lead to a design that is programmatically unacceptable, right? What do we mean by programmatically unacceptable? If the public is not going to accept NASA's, risk loss, then one of two things happens, right? One, the program is canceled because the Senate or the Congress doesn't fund it. Or two, they lie to the public and don't let them know what the actual risk numbers were, which was the case, by the way, in the moon landings, where the PRA analysis showed a likelihood of success of 1 in 3. And sometimes that's how these things happen. All right, so that threshold that we're setting, it can and should change as we get new evidence, as we learn more about our system, right? And so safe enough now starts to have a definition, right? It exhibits a mean, in this case, loss of crew, probability of loss of crew value that's less than or equal to a specified threshold with some given level of statistical certainty. And that means reducing the spacecraft's mean probability of loss of crew, right? Reducing the spacecraft's probability of loss of crew uncertainty, or increasing the acceptable risk threshold, moving this way, okay? That is what safe enough technically means, but you always are going to have this question, who decides what is safe enough? You can put all the definitions you want on it, but at the end of the day, somebody has to make a decision. Somebody has to put their names on. And it is critically important when we're thinking about this to keep in mind that decisions must be made by individuals, not committees. Because when the clarity for the accountability of a decision is lost, the outcomes can be catastrophic, right? This is everybody's trying to cover their ass and hide behind everybody else, and everybody just says, go. Originally, Morton Thiokol said that they did not want to proceed with the Space Shuttle launch of the Challenger, and because of pressure from NASA, they revised their recommendation. So you have to have a risk threshold that's set by an individual so that you can then have that person on the hot seat for that decision. They have to be accountable for it. Okay. So as I mentioned, right, in the Challenger disaster, we had that big difference between the engineer's assessment of risk and the manager's assessment of risk. And there's this question of who's right. And so part of that process that eventually came to be exercised by NASA and by lots of other groups is you have something called continuous risk management, meaning you're not just going to make a decision and leave it there. You are going to take all the things you learned from every event, in this case, the Space Shuttle launches, and you're going to feed them back in as evidence to analyze your own risk, look at mitigations. In this case, we're talking about HSRB, but the process is similar for management for some other things. And the HSRB, what we're looking at is how do we decide what are the most important things to fund in terms of those human system risks? And so from that perspective, same process, right? You have to have some evidence to identify a risk or to analyze it. You plan for what you're going to do about mitigating it. You get approval from your board, and then you implement and track what you did. And as you do these things, as you fly more missions, you feed that evidence back in. Now, from the HSRB perspective, from human research and stuff like that, some of that evidence that comes back in may be from space flight, some of it may be from analogs, some of it may be from animal science, whatever it is. But you're trying to get as much information as you can to tell, hey, is our risk posture correct? Is our understanding of where we are on how safe this stuff is it correct? And every time we iterate on these things, every time we run experiments, hopefully we're learning something about whether it is or not and feeding that back into the system. This is how you start with places where we don't know a whole lot about them and build up, is through iteration. In engineering world, that means testing over and over again. In the human research world, that means funding science and doing experiments over and over again, right? And taking information from any place you can get it and feeding it back into the system. All right, so let's say we've flown now for 70 years for humans, and we seem to have done pretty well, according to most people. Certainly the programs are continuing, we think. Certainly with things changing, I guess we'll find out. But a lot of things are changing. And what that means is that we have to think about what those changes mean for the risk perspective. So for one thing, the missions are changing, right? We have, for the last 25 years, mainly had NASA focusing on the ISS along with their international partners. And very recently, that has all changed. And now you've got some people doing suborbital flights like Blue Origin, some people doing orbital flights to the space station commercially, some people doing orbital flights that are not to the space station and have nothing to do with a government agency. So those missions are changing. And even the government agencies are saying, hey, we're done. We're not just going to do the ISS. We're going to go back to the moon and we're going to go on to Mars, right? And as those things change, you can no longer rely on your prior risk numbers. You have to start reconsidering the new scenario. Same thing from the health and life perspective or survival perspective for the people who are flying, right? For the last 25, really 60, 70 years, we have selected out risk from the humans because we had so much risk in the vehicles and the technology. And now these commercial companies can't do that anymore. So now you have a new risk factor. That PRA analysis that I showed you for the space shuttle, the human failing, or the chances of the human failing, were actually a fudge factor in those calculations. All of that risk was in the vehicle. As the vehicles get better and as we go longer and farther out into space, the proportion of risk that those humans themselves are going to bring in is increasing. And what we're asking people to do is changing, right? Not only are we having people who might be less healthy, but we're also asking them to go do different things. For the last 25 years, we've had people doing science on the space station, maybe some spacewalks here and there. I don't think we've ever gone above 5 spacewalks in a 6 months mission on the space station, and they were done in microgravity, right? And now we're saying go to the moon and do partial gravity spacewalks again. And maybe, especially from the sustainability perspective, maybe we want you to do construction. And we had done some construction for the ISS and microgravity, but now construction in a partial gravity environment is different. And so the activities that we're doing are changing the risk story. And with all of these things changing, we have to necessarily go back to looking at reevaluating the risks that we're encountering. So it's reasonable to ask, what are those things that drive risk? Because I'm kind of hinting at them, right? Well, there's a number of different things. So when you hear folks talk about those 5 space hazards of spaceflight, they're capturing part of the risk. They're thinking about what's changing the humans in there, right? And those 5 hazards are really associated with time of exposure. So mission duration in like a microgravity environment. So you have gravity, altered gravity, radiation, isolation, confinement, and hostile closed environment. And those are really things that decondition the humans over time. So they end up raising risk because they decrease the human's ability as a part of the system to respond to anomalies and things go wrong. On the other hand, when you hear about distance from Earth, right, that's less about deconditioning the human and more about the restrictive nature of what can we bring to make sure that we can keep them healthy, right? The mass, power, and volume envelope gets smaller and smaller the farther you go from Earth. And in addition to that, you got things like communications delays. You change your evacuation time. Change your evacuation time. Consumables resupply becomes a challenge if you go farther from Earth. But these are not the only things. So when you hear those 5 hazards of spaceflight, they're not the only things that drive risk. You have vehicle resource constraints, your mass, your power, your volume, your data bandwidth that is available for things. You have a habitable volume and capability within the vehicles, right? The crew selection and assignment drives risk. Who did you select? And did they train together, for example? High risk activities. Are you doing EVAs or not? Because EVAs bring a whole different risk category. If you're not doing any EVAs from the ISS, you're not worried as much about things like decompression sickness. So all of these things change that equation of risk. And at the end of the day, the organization and their risk tolerance may have more effect on this stuff than almost anything else. But all of these things drive risk. It can make it worse if you are not considering these things. And so you remember at the very beginning where we were talking about vehicle-centric versus person-centric, and all the risk things, the outcomes that I gave you were vehicle-centric so far, that loss of crew, loss of mission, loss of vehicle. That's about the vehicle failing, right? But what if the vehicle doesn't fail? What if it's the human that fails? What if the human can't do their job? That's different from vehicle-centric and vehicle failure. And this is one of the big challenges that NASA has had over the years, is that they have very readily embraced vehicle-centric things, but they have very struggled with person-centric things. So we have to define other outcomes. And these are the outcomes that we define, right? Loss of crew life, which is one crew life, not all of them. Consideration of evacuation. Loss of mission objectives, right? Apollo 13 lost the entire moon mission, but what if one of their objectives was to get the crew back alive? Then they didn't lose all of the mission. They succeeded with one of their mission objectives. Long-term health consequences, right? Nobody cares if after the vehicle's mission is done, if it's okay. But for the human, there's a big deal there. They may have a long time to live, and if they're getting cancer long-term from the space radiation they encountered, right, then we haven't done them any favors, and we have to figure out how to deal with that. The engineers that are working on the vehicle side of things don't, right? And that inability to recertify an astronaut for flight is also a risk, because the agency takes a risk when they lose access to veteran astronauts, when they are not able to take their best flyers and put them up to the missions that they would be best serving in. And these are things that happen regularly. So if we define these things, right, then the question that you're going to ask, or hopefully are thinking about, is how do we then quantify and think about those things? And that's where things like the overall risk matrix that you see here come from, is putting these definitions onto things and then putting them into what's called a Boston matrix. That's what these things are, an L/C matrix, as a way to communicate some of the high level insight that we have into risk. Inevitably, this loses some level of granularity, but trying to keep things high level, we had to set definitions for these things, for the likelihood and for the consequences. And when we do that, what you see over here is that, you put things into green, yellow, red, which naturally sort of merge with our understanding of what's high risk and what's low risk. And high likelihood and high consequence are the worst of those things. And as we drive down likelihood through prevention, or drive down the consequence, in the health cases, that means through treatment, or in vehicle cases, like through repairs, for example, right? As we drive those things down, then those risks become less concerning. So the last time we put this out in public was the last time I put this out in public, which is unfortunate because that was published in July of 2023, and now we're in the middle of 2025. And this is where all of those different 30 risks that NASA had about the humans sat at that time, right? So over on the left, you've got that human system risk or concern, and there's a difference between those two things. And then up here, the different DRM, design reference missions. So there's some missions in low Earth orbit, and they're broken up between short, which is defined as less than 30 days, or long, which is up to a year, right? Same thing for, are we going to lunar orbit, like the Gateway? Or are we going to lunar orbit plus surface? That's what's lost here, is plus surface, which is a whole different thing when you actually go down to the surface. And then there's these Mars missions, right? And these were the ranges, 730 to 1,224 days, were the ranges of the Mars missions that we were realistically considering. And this less than 1 year thing right here was what we called a Mars precursor mission, where we would simulate what was going to happen with Mars, with the communication delays and other things like that, to try to test out our systems. And you see this different block of greens, yellows, and reds. So you'll hear people talk about red risks as something that's, bad. Well, let me just clear something up. When you are doing red, yellow, greens, like a risk matrix for something like the ISS or a Dragon spacecraft themselves, red may mean no go, mean we can't do this until we fix it. When it comes to the human system risks that you see here that NASA was looking at, red does not mean no go. Red is trying to give some insight to the rest of the agency who doesn't understand the humans as well. What ballpark of risk are you taking if you decide to go at this point, right? And over time, hopefully we drive some of these down. But that's a really key point that you've got to keep in the back of your mind. So when we're trying to do this stuff, when we're looking at all these different risks and we're saying, hey, we want to take these reds and make them yellow, we take these yellows and make them green, right? In the case of human research, what you're talking about is, where do we allocate dollars, right? It's the decision that you're making to put dollars into this or dollars into that to drive down that risk, hopefully through scientific research. When you're talking about, should we fly the SpaceX Dragon, for example, right? It's not about where did the dollars go. It is about, where is unacceptable mission risk? And if we focus on that, what are the alternatives to the current plan or to the current things we're doing that can allow us to bring that risk down? And perhaps we should be entertaining those alternatives, researching those alternatives, or implementing alternatives to what we've kind of got in the plan or design right now. Either way, right, we're trying to get to that decision-making, right? We are trying to use risk information to inform decision makers. Remember when I told you that somebody has to be the person who sets that threshold? Well, in every single one of these roles, somebody has to be the person to make a decision on any of these questions, right? In the chief health and medical officer, they're asking, are the appropriate safeguards in place for our astronauts? And they look at that through human rating for spacecraft and through using the Health and Medical Technical Authority, HMTA, right? They're saying, are the flight programs safe enough? Or do we need to stop something and say, no, this isn't safe enough? No, you need to go back to the drawing board. That's what a technical authority does, right? But outside the technical authority, there are other stakeholders. NASA has program managers, right? They're wondering if their flight program is safe enough, and they're asking themselves, what trades should I make? What is it that, if I include it and take out something else, is going to make my risk go down, is going to make it safer for my astronaut? Flight operations director who assigns the astronauts, are they going to be able to do the job we sent them to do? Space medicine operations, is my astronaut in good health? How do we maintain it, right? These are questions that they have to answer. And in order to do so, right, they have to have a set of risk information. And they have to define what is good enough health. The human research program is asking that question, what should we be researching to reduce future risk? And how much money should we allocate to those things? Because what they're trying to do is drive down risk when we go to future programs. But FOD and current space medicine operations, they're focused on, what do we do today? with the astronauts that we have? Are there flight rules we should implement to try to make them safer? Because we really can't go back to the design drawing board with the vehicles and stuff. We're already in that program. So risk-informed decision-making is the other side of the coin from continuous risk management, right? Continuous risk management is let's go do these things, learn from them, and feed that information back in a loop over time. Risk-informed decision-making is let's put enough money and resources into understanding our risk and give that to the people who need to make decisions so that they do so from an informed place. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more, right, for this lecture. Where are we getting our ideas about where risk comes from? Well, we get them from the things that have already happened, right? Apollo 13, everybody knows that story, right? We had this challenge where they stirred the oxygen tanks and something blew up, and then they were potentially going to lose the entire crew. And through some amazing feats of engineering, they did not. They saved them, right? But also, less well known is that Fred Hayes on this also had a urinary tract infection that led him to become septic. And researching and understanding what happened there gets fed back into our understanding of what our potential failure modes are. So, when they got back and they measured his urine, they found that he had a Pseudomonas aeruginosa strain in the urine that was resistant to the 2 antibiotics they had on board the Apollo vehicle. So the feedback loop there says, hey, this is now possible, and this is something that elevates our risk. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to change the antibiotics? Are we going to change our procedures to keep somebody from wearing the condom cath too long? How are we going to feed that back in, right? What you're seeing here is a post-void ultrasound from one of the astronauts, both in space right here and on the ground. And what you see is this astronaut went to pee. On the ground, his bladder's small. It's not full of fluid. Up in space, he went to pee and he still has a whole bunch of urine in there. And there's this open question, right? Our urinary tract infections, which maybe seem to be more likely in males up in space than females, is it something that's caused by this? Well, if we prioritize it enough, we can go up there and look and kind of take the data and inform ourselves. But we really haven't done that to date because it hasn't been a big enough priority for us to go do that and feed that information back into the system. When we talk about behavioral health, right, we look at what happened in the past instead of just making up stories about who might go crazy, right? Dan Tanney's mother was hit by a train when he was up on the space station and died. And, then there's this question of, from the behavioral health perspective, from his own mental health, from his processes for grieving, right? What can we do to support them? What are the behavioral health countermeasures that we can put in place? And that information from an event like that feeds back into our system. And we're still learning, right? In 2018, this was the paper that announced that this is the first time we've seen DVTs, deep vein thrombosis, in space. And they found it incidentally on a research study where they noticed that they weren't getting any flow in the right jugular vein on a research subject. And then they changed it over to a clinical study and started looking at it from the astronaut's perspective. And it was like, oh, shit, this is something that actually seems to be happening now. So what do we do about it? There was a lot of discussion, right? What do we do about this and what's safe? Because it's not as simple as just applying terrestrially what we would do. There's a lot of other puts and takes. For example, if they have to deorbit and come home, their only way home at that time was the Soyuz, and that's like a controlled car crash. And so if you're going to treat the DVT with anticoagulation medicine, now you're going to also put them potentially into a car crash while anticoagulating. And did you just raise their risk? Did you just make it less safe? These are a lot of challenging questions that had to be addressed there. So we learn from that and feed that back into our system. Similarly, fires, carbon monoxide poisoning, right? We've had several episodes of fires. On the left, you see the S fog. That was the oxygen canister that caught fire on Mir in 1997. And that actually burned very cleanly, but there was a lot of smoke, and it was very terrifying for the astronauts. The astronaut who was up there, the U.S. astronaut who was up there, was an emergency physician. He was considering whether to intubate to protect the airways and the lungs of his colleagues, and considering whether he had to intubate himself. The one on the right was called the BMP fire, and that was just a puff of smoke that people saw that came out from behind a console, and they found, that there was some charring there, some electrical thing had happened. They replaced it. They thought they were all done, and because we weren't actively measuring the atmosphere, we were using our astronauts as canaries in the coal mine. All of the astronauts started getting headaches, and then they turned on the carbon monoxide monitor and found out that they were at 500 parts per million of carbon monoxide because whatever had burned had released all this carbon monoxide into the atmosphere. Their safe level at which they were supposed to put on the oxygen masks was 200 parts per million. So they went right past that, and basically their sensing mechanism was people. And so you would think maybe they took that information and fed it back in and said, you know what, we're going to have the carbon monoxide monitors on all the time. And the answer is no, they never did that, even on the space station. And with replacements to the monitors, they've never turned them on all the time because they think the risk is low enough that they don't have to worry about it as much as other things, right? Where they put the effort. Remember when I told you EVA drives risk, right? It drives it through injuries. It drives it through overuse challenges. It drives it potentially through decompression sickness. Hypoxia, hypercarbia can occur. And equipment failure is a very big one, right? So equipment failure, we saw in 2014 with astronaut Luca Parmitano, that fluid was exiting his cooling garment and eventually kind of came over his face and eventually almost got trained into his breathing. And they were able to get him back in, but he had a lot of trouble getting back in. So we have tried to iterate on that, tried to figure out how to fix those. Or in many cases, we've still had people who have still been getting some of these issues. So, the goal is to try to feed back as much information as possible in risk management. The reality in any space program is that there are significantly competing resources and challenges that are going on, and you have to prioritize what are you going to go after first. We've seen and learned over time about SANS, where the back of the eyeball gets compressed, where you have vision loss. And that process that we went through over time, that was first reported in 2011 in the Mater paper. And then over time, we have continued to invest resources in that because vision is a big one in terms of operability within spaceflight, as well as general health for the astronauts and long-term health. So this is one area that did get a lot of resources, and we're still continuing to try to learn about it. So we have all these different groups out there who do research within different areas according to their interests and their training. And you have this question that kind of keeps coming up in the risk domain, which is somebody brings up this idea that this could happen in spaceflight, right? And at the end of the day, everybody can make some story lead to worst case scenario somehow. So I'll give you a couple of examples. My old boss, Bill Pulaski, used to tell me, when you're talking to scientists, you got to keep in mind that they can all turn a hangnail into a death sentence when they're fighting for their funding, right? And so conflicts of interest in the way that folks kind of advocate for the things they're interested in are very real, and it's a part of doing business of risk management. Is people are going to be telling you, "Oh, this is the biggest thing we know." And it happened to me when I was a risk manager many times, where people would come up and say, "Well, what are you going to do if this happens?" And the answer is, "Well, this is where that risk is sitting when we've quantified it, and here's the 10 other things that were actually higher in our analysis for concern than that." So which one of those things do you think I should remove in order to fund your thing? You're going to hear this in a lot of different areas. For example, everybody who's pushing the idea of surgery in space, right? The question mark is, yeah, it's fascinating, but when are we going to need it? What's driving that need? And holistically, what do the resources look like that would take to put it in place? Because many of those things can kind of unseat or lower the priority compared to other things. Similarly with things like kidney stones, right? People will tell you kidney stones are a big deal in space. People will tell you that dysrhythmias are a big deal in space. There have been 9 cases of atrial fibrillation in the astronaut corps. 0 of them happened in space. Okay. Of all of the astronauts who have flown, many have had kidney stones that have happened after flight at some point, but we've had 0 proven kidney stones in flight. 1 case where we think that there might have been a kidney stone in flight, who was a Russian pretty early on, and they looked at potentially evacuating him, and then all of a sudden he got better, and they thought, well, it must have been a kidney stone, right? Not proven, not documented, but we've got kidney stones as a red risk because of some of our own biases. So what I've got up here, this quote, comes from Jim Bajan, who's one of the retired NASA astronauts. And he talks about, in general, this suggestion for further study is often a familiar element, but it must have a sufficiently high priority that it can be satisfied when compared with other alternative demands for resources. And that's the art and the science of risk management, right? Is comparing these things and saying, we have limited resources. So what are we doing? What are we going to actually prioritize? And his admonishment is important. In the final analysis, knowledge must not be pursued for knowledge's sake alone. There's nothing wrong with basic research. It's important, right? But when we're actually running a program, applied research is something that is really critical in terms of driving down risk. The knowledge to be gained must have some hypothetical greater value compared with other opportunities. Put another way, the value of further future study has to outweigh the value that might be realized were the resources applied elsewhere. And so I want you to apply this when you hear people automatically say things like, our biggest problem in space flight is radiation, or we absolutely need surgery in space, or this or that or the next thing, right? Bring it to a quantitative analysis so that you compare it to other things and say, okay, yeah, I'm not saying it's not important, but is it as important as all these other problems that we're facing? Because overall, when we look at this, right, health and performance are related to those things that are those end outcomes that we talked about, loss of mission objectives and loss of mission. The hazards that we face in spaceflight, the things that start working on people as they become, as they are flying in space, as you put them up there, you launch somebody up there, and their body starts responding to the environment. Those risks drive where is their health at, which drives where is their readiness to do things. They might not be the only person up there. So, other people might be able to help them or replace them. But at some point, you get to, can they do the jobs that they are sent there to do? And if they can't, for whatever reason, and not all of those reasons are health related, right? Some of them, you could be perfectly healthy, right? And if you didn't bring enough spares to repair the part that's broken, then that task isn't getting done and you're going to lose potentially mission objectives. So you got to keep that whole picture in mind as we think about risk overall. Sometimes I like to put this up here because when you ask, well, how much risk is there, right? How much risk do we really have in bear attacks here on Earth, right? It's a really low number, but when you start comparing it to 0 because there's no bears in other areas, you can make those into potentially high numbers comparatively, right? So you always have to consider absolute risk, not just relative risk. So there's a couple of quotes to kind of keep in mind, right? One is that you need to know that people, including the experts and including the managements, are really bad at assessing probabilities of events. And this is why we have to use math, PRA analysis, other things to kind of check ourselves, right? It's a skill we should expect to be critical to proper assessment of risks. And the other big one to kind of keep in the back of your mind is not just do we have our biases and are we bad at risk assessment implicitly, but also that when we're making decisions about the things, they have to be made by individuals, right? I'm back to James Bajian's quote, decisions must be made by individuals, not committees. Because when the clarity for the accountability of a decision is lost, the outcomes can be catastrophic, and that is true across the board. So there's several different ways that we address our own bias and our own inability to do good risk management in our head, right? And to try to make sure that we have accountability for that. There's all sorts of different stuff here. We use these simple stratification methods like the heat map when we're communicating. That's that red, green, and red, yellow, green stuff, right? We use that when we're trying to communicate up the chain to get people in the ballpark. But when you're doing actual analysis of risk, we're using probabilistic models to give us those specific incidences or likelihoods for specific outcomes, because that is the best that we are able to do quantitatively. And so you've seen some of these before, right? From other talks that we've had, where we can calculate something like a crew health index and ask how performance is changing over different types of missions, over the duration of different missions, and depending on what we bring. And what you start to see here is that the methods that we've used in the past, which are selecting really healthy people, they start to break down somewhere between 40 and 180 days in our best ways of calculating them. So we're not going to keep our risk low for long duration missions by selecting out people. We are going to improve our risk by designing space health systems that meet people where they are and keep them healthy, right? That's a critical part of it. That is one of those outcomes, right? Health index. That's a calculation based on quality time lost and things like that. Another one of those outcomes, right? What's the likelihood of loss of crew life? Well, as we go farther into space, those PRA numbers that we use, this is like from IMM, which is probably not the best today, but it was what we were using at the time, shows you a pretty significant difference between how bad it can be and if you don't design in medical stuff that you need, and how low we can get that risk. How low are we reasonably likely to get it? And by reasonably, what I mean is, well, what if we give them the best medical system we've ever flown? That would be the one on the ISS. So those Mars missions, 730 days, 1195 days, right? Even the best that we are likely to get to, probably just from the medical component alone, is still worse than the overall risk they took getting on the space shuttle, right? They're still, in these durations, the PRA is telling us the risk that the human starts bringing to the system becomes significant, okay? And it's not just the risk that the humans bring, but they've got to be able to deal with things that happen on the mission, right? Right now, we've got all these people in mission control helping them in real time. But remember, over time, as they're deconditioning, or if more and more medical things are happening that we're not able to take care of, right? How are they going to be able to respond to the things that go wrong with their vehicle? They are the ones keeping it alive, right? So this is the anomalies for the International Space Station. The blue is the total high priority IFEs, items for investigation. And the red are the ones that are filtered for, hey, this was probably going to kill the crew if we didn't have, the 80 people in mission control monitoring that thing and helping guide them through this stuff in real time. So the takeaway on this is that they need to be at the top of their game. They need to have their performance high, if for no other reason than to stay on top of keeping the damn vehicle working, right? 1.7 times a year was the average over 20 years for the ISS. In the first 6 years of the ISS's operation, it was more like 3 to 4 times a year. So potentially 12 events through a 3 years Mars mission. So why does it matter, right? Because those humans are being pushed on and compressed and, struggling and deconditioned by the space flight environment. And we're always thinking about how the crew is impacted. But it's much more important to think about, well, what does the crew bring to the mission? What are they doing there? They're not just passengers. They're doing things that can't be done by computer systems, and they're doing things that can't be done by people who are remotely controlling things. Complex procedure execution, knowledge integration, causal diagnostics, anomaly response. All of these things are human unique, and they are dependent on the mental health and fitness and the physical health and fitness of the crew to deal with things that go wrong in space. Now, I've said a lot of that about in-flight stuff, but then there's this question about long-term health. And so I would be remiss if I didn't at least address the question of radiation. So you will find this. I put it into the Vollinia article on Beyond Leo. I can share it with folks. But this is a look at the range of REID, risk of exposure-induced death, for different missions. The ISS, the lunar surface for a year, the lunar surface for 30 days. You'll notice that Solar Min and Solar Max are here for like Mars missions, right? When we try to calculate and figure out how likely are our astronauts to get cancer and die from it at some point after these missions, right? These are the types of graphs and numbers that you need to be aware of. And I will talk about this in later lectures, but just wanted to put it out there, right? For a very long time, we said that if the upper boundary here, the upper 95% confidence interval went above 3, then astronauts were not allowed to fly anymore. This is career radiation dosage. So what I want you to take away and understand is REID is an excess number. This is like what we're calculating from what we know about our biology and about the space radiation they'd encounter. And these models aren't perfect, right? But they're, in many cases, the best we have. What you really should be looking at is where this X is, right? The mean value of REID. This is the boxes that you see here, right? They're reflecting this distribution that we have. And most of the density of incidence, most of the density of that REID is here between 25 to 75%. That mean value is right here. This is how likely are you to die, right? Chances in 100 from that radiation exposure. So what you're really talking about is in the worst case scenario for Mars mission, 3 years, Solar Min, worst case scenario, the mean value adds about 4 to 4.5% excess chance of dying at some point in your life, right? Doesn't mean you retire from being an astronaut, you die immediately. You could be 100 years old when you get cancer and die from it, right? So it's not a very granular measure, but it's the best that we've got right now. And so you're adding on at mean about 4.5% maybe of additional likelihood of dying. So how likely are you to die just because you're human and you could get cancer? Somewhere around 12%. So this is adding on another 4.5%. How likely are you to die from cancer if you're a smoker? Somewhere between 17 and 24%, right? So you're taking a normal human and saying, hey, yeah, we're raising it up a little bit, but you're probably not even as bad as making them a smoker. And this is what I mean by trying to start comparing apples and oranges, right? Because if you think that radiation is the worst thing out there because of the cancer that might eventually happen someday, our best estimates on that need to be taken into account quantitatively and compared to, well, what are the chances that they're going to die from all that medical stuff that they're going to get in mission? And where should we be prioritizing what it is that we're working on? Risk overall is not about trying to minimize medical risk or not trying to minimize performance risk, right? Yeah, you could, by including a whole bunch of stuff, drive the medical risk way down. But then what's going to happen is because you have a limited mass and volume of a system for the spacecraft, you're going to drive all the non-medical risk way up. What if you're not bringing enough fuel? What if you're not bringing enough air, right? Those things matter more than whether or not you have enough Band-Aids. So we're never trying to drive medical risk down low. We're trying to look at it in the systems context and trying to find the nadir of total risk. The ideal mission risk is where can we put it at the lowest when all these things are added together? And keeping that in perspective is critical. So This is lecture 1. The next lectures are going to be, well, how does NASA's management processes work? How do we do them? So you're familiar with it. Third one's going to be on quantifying risk. How do we do math? The fourth one's going to be on levels of evidence and what we should take seriously and what we shouldn't. And the fifth one's going to be on causal diagramming so that we can communicate risk in appropriate ways across the different sets of experts that we need to do and get a shared mental model in our mind. And that's where I'm going to stop today. And I am happy to take questions if people have them at the moment. And here's some final thoughts for people to keep in the back of their mind. So, Brian, you have the first option of discussing anything that we want to talk about from this first one. This is just setting the stage for understanding risk better. And I don't know how many people are on now, but if folks have questions, I'm willing to stay on for a little bit longer too.
This is a great lecture. I am really looking forward to seeing kind of what how you expand upon that in those categories there. I guess just, and maybe is too broad of a for just a subject for you to get for a couple of minutes. But I'm wondering just how kind of with commercial spaceflight organizations and how they are entering into this, and how budget is always a concern when making these decisions about risk, how the focus on profitability will affect that, the ability to make like our whole decision process, and how we, make risk calculations for the individual as well as the mission, and likely the growing disparity between those things.
Well, you can look at a lot of other industries for that, right? There is always a temptation to cut corners. And honestly, there are open questions about what is actually cutting corners and what is just cutting red tape, right? Because, is NASA too risk averse? I don't know. It's hard to say, right? Are they too risk averse for what some of the commercial companies want to do? Maybe. Are they too risk averse for some of the people who want to go up and would never pass their medical things? Probably, right? There's lots of folks that can probably fly, but for NASA, it was oftentimes about trying to make sure that somebody could stay as an active astronaut for a decade or longer, right? And they didn't have to show a profit, as you're saying. Every company that exists right now has some way that they manage risk. Oil companies and pharmaceutical companies and all these things. And there's always that tension there between profitability, cutting corners. Do we give a little bit on that risk threshold and make it a little less safe because it's a little bit more achievable for us? And achievable can be defined by different things, right? It can be defined by the profit that you make, total revenues, all that sort of stuff, as opposed to just health and performance. And so each of those companies has to make a decision on, early in their lifetimes, where all of them are right now, what is a bad outcome going to do to their long-term solvency? And that remains to be seen. The other area of risk that is not defined yet is legal risk and liability, right? As it stands, only Lloyd's of London is insuring some flights, not all of them. So insurance companies are asking themselves, how do we actually deal with this? And what they would normally turn to are actuarial statistics, which they don't have for space flight. And so, providing PRA numbers and the best that we have is a way for those companies to try to get their heads around it. But everybody's learning at the same time. And that's part of what makes it interesting right now in the industry. So the answer is, I don't know. But hopefully over the time that you're in fellowship, and you rotate with some of these companies, you'll get some more insight into that and maybe teach me.
Sounds great. That's awesome. Thank you.
All right. Anything else that anybody wants to ask about right now? Okay. Brian?
Oh, I was also just going to add that those additional lectures that you mentioned that are coming up, I will also be emailing out Zoom links and reminders for those. And we actually have 2 next week. So look forward to seeing as many of you as possible there.
All right. If nobody has any other, oh, wait, there's some things in the chat here. Maybe that's what I should be looking at. Let's see. Were there questions in the chat? I see Martina says something about CO2 pockets. Martina, what were you getting at?
She put that question down when you were talking about carbon monoxide monitors.
Oh, okay. We do monitor carbon dioxide because that's much more likely to be a problem for astronauts, and that is different from carbon monoxide. But understanding how you measure it is kind of critical, because what they do is they have grab canisters for comparisons, and they have these instruments that can measure it, but they only measure it in certain locations. And whether you can extrapolate to other locations is a challenge, so that NASA has done fluid dynamic modeling of the flow of air within the vehicle. But now you're talking about a modeling prediction that may or may not necessarily match reality, regardless of how good the CFD is. And so you struggle with some of this, right? Like the astronauts, if you were at our book club when we read Endurance by Scott Kelly, you heard him in that book talking about his sensitivity to carbon dioxide an awful lot, and those pockets and stuff, right? But, so he may be sitting in a private area or in front of a glove box and have a pocket of CO2 in front of him, and the monitors may be saying, no, the CO2 is at 2 parts per million, right? What's the problem? The astronauts are much more sensitive to these things. They are detectors. And so there's a tension there between, and you'll hear this within the industry, right? People will be like, oh, well, they're kind of babies, right? Well, maybe not, but they're the ones experiencing it. And we're like, our ability to measure and sense things like CO2 is extremely limited. And that's part of why for many years, we had a lot of discussions that eventually pushed and it's a very specific wording, right? 24-hour volume averaged CO2 measurements down, right? Because you got to figure out, like, how are we actually measuring this stuff? So it was hard to have those discussions from a risk management perspective. Some of the only data that we had was on headaches. And so you inevitably get engineers saying, well, how big of a deal is it? It's just a headache. We got bigger fish to fry. And so we spent years trying to figure out, okay, do we have data that says it also can affect their cognitive functioning? And there was mixed information on that for a long time. And I think some of the jury's still out on some of it, but we didn't see cognitive declines, but there was terrestrial data that said that CO2 does affect cognitive decline. And so, these are really a challenge when you're trying to bring forth information that helps change people's minds about risk overall. And that was CO2 is actually a great example of some of that. Over time, we did get it pushed down.
Yeah, my microphone had problems connecting before, but basically I'm thinking, like, if CO2 is not evenly distributed in places like International Space Station, and if the measurement is just at certain locations, has anyone considered putting CO2 detectors or measurement on the astronauts? So this way we would know if they are in area, like in the CO2 pocket, which supposedly exists, but like not officially.
Well, you end up in this place where you're like, am I measuring the exhalation of the astronauts, or am I measuring a pocket that's just sitting there? And so, definitely within spacesuits and in some other areas, they've looked at end-tidal CO2. But you end up in a place where you continuously ask this question, hey, it's costing a lot of money to go do this stuff and to try it out, try to figure this out. Is it worth it? Right? Because of how much it costs to even just go ask some of these questions. So have people thought of it? Absolutely. Have they done it? A little bit. Was it worth it? Hard to say, right? Was it worth it to stop a couple more headaches? That's the perspective that the engineers have, right? Are you sure you want to spend, a couple $1 million trying to get these measurements in order to stop a couple headaches? And so it's that type of thing that you're pushing back against when you're working in human health and performance.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Well, this is part of why the interdisciplinary discussions between engineers and medicine and other folks are so important, is to try to get people a little bit more insight from each other's point of view. All right. Well, then I am going to wrap it up and go have dinner. Thank you all for listening in. I guess we got 2 more next week. The only person who's required to be here is Brian, but everybody's welcome.